ladies and gentlemen, welcome to yet another Levantine Heritage Foundation talk. My name is Michael Katakis. I'm a trustee of the Levantine Heritage Foundation. I'm a historian as well as a consultant. I run a consulting firm that does much of its work in Ukraine, as we've been discussing now with Julian. So this event carries a special interest for me personally. The Levantine Heritage Foundation is a well-established association which seeks to promote the history, politics and culture of the Levant and its port cities. We organise several events a year. This is one of many that we've organised so far. We have another event on the 26th of July where the speaker is Michael Vatitiotis and he'll be presenting material from his book, Lives Between Lines. I encourage all of you to join. I should plug this at the start before we get into the nitty-gritty of Odesa, which is a very different subject. So, as I've mentioned, the Levantine Heritage Foundation usually focuses on topics related to the Levant, the port cities, Smyrna, Istanbul, Beirut, Alexandria, to name but a few. Today we'll be focusing on a different subject, that of Odesa, great port city, not of the Levant, but of the Black Sea region. Obviously, Odesa has similarities with several Levantine cities. It was highly cosmopolitan, a hybrid city of many different demographic groups. It grew rich thanks to a bountiful agricultural hinterland. It had connections spanning not only east and west, but also north and south. And it occupied a civilizational fault line, which was frequently beset by dramatic ruptures which under normal circumstances would be totally destructive to a city. But like with all great cities, its past informs and acts as a guide for the present and for the future. Now, the Russian annexation of Crimea in 2014 and the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022 present yet another challenge for the great city of Odesa, calling upon it to demonstrate all of its urban ingenuity and ability to shift shapes without losing its unique identity and effervescence. And we're delighted today to be welcoming one of the world's great authorities on Odesa, Julian Evans. Julian has a very long personal connection with Odesa. I believe you visited Odesa for the first time in 1994, and you got married in Odesa. It's interesting, your bio suggests you got married in a monastery opposite the station. So interesting that was highlighted in the bio, but clearly something to talk about. And you had a family in Odesa, and you've been long connected with the city. So Julian's been writing about Odesa for almost 30 years. His recent book is called Undefeatable, Odesa in Love and War. And I think you're going to be discussing material from the book or weaving in material from the book in your lecture today. So how are we going to do this? Julian's going to speak for the first part of the event today. After that, I'm not going to do the Q&A. Philip is going to do the Q&A. Sadly, I must leave after about an hour to catch a flight at Heathrow Airport. So I'll be passing over to Philip to conduct the Q&A. At that stage, all of you can come in and ask your questions to Julian. Now, before I pass over to Julian, I would like to mention that several participants from Ukraine were going to attend this event this evening, but sadly, due to the heavy bombing of most Ukrainian cities last night, there have been severe power outages and internet is not readily usable. So unfortunately, these people cannot attend the online aspect of the event. But nevertheless, since this event is recorded, I'm going to say a couple of words in Ukrainian, just so it's on the record and these people feel included in some way. So для нас це велика честь мати можливість представити цей захід цього вечора. Нам шкода, що ви не можете бути тут, але ми сподіваємося, що вам сподобається захід, і ви порішите його на широке коло. So, thank you very much, and Julian, over to you.
Thank you very much. Um, Hello, everybody. Yeah, there we are. Another visitor. So, uh, thanks so much for being here. I feel I'm slightly split personality because I'm talking to you on Zoom, and I also have a room full of listeners too. Here to talk to you about Odesa. Odesa's past, its present, its links with the Levant, but I think those aspects will probably come out in the question and answer, perhaps, because that will be for the experience of some of the people in this room, I'm sure, to nudge me in that direction. My real concern in writing my book, which I didn't intend to write at the beginning of the time when the war started, because I couldn't see a way to write a book that wouldn't be just another well-informed, relatively well-informed tell about the state of Odesa and what of the state of Ukraine, what's going on there. Until I went there in November 22, so towards the end of the first year of the all-out invasion, and spent a month in the city under, well, it was being, the energy supplies being hit, so we were blacked out for an awful lot of the time. And I was there to try and help, and I wanted to see what it was like, and I felt too safe in England. And I suddenly, in the darkness, realized that this wasn't just Ukrainians and hopes and memories that were, and lives that were being attacked. But I felt very physically, very viscerally that my memories, all my memories of this city over 30 years, were under threat. And it was at that moment that I started making notes and trying to put together a story of those 25, 30 years alongside the story of what was happening now. And so that was how the book came about. But I'd like to start tonight. This isn't about me, it's about Odesa. And I'd like to start by an anecdote about the city. In fact, before I do that, I will just bring up this slide of just a quick reminder of where the city lies in the top northwest corner of the Black Sea. And as you see from those red and pink markings there, quite close to where the Russian occupied area is. But optimistically, I'd like to point out that in March 22, when the Russians had first invaded, they occupied 30% of the territory of Ukraine, and they now occupy 19% of the territory of Ukraine. So that's worth bearing in mind. But there is Odesa down at the bottom of Ukraine, between Moldova and the Black Sea. And you can see that given its position, it's always been close to a way out into the Mediterranean, out to the cities of the Levant, out towards Europe. And that will come up a lot in what the stories I'd like to tell you tonight. Back to the anecdote. Odesa's Opera House. The present opera and ballet theatre, which you can see in the slide, was completed in 1887. It's designed in Viennese Baroque by an Austrian studio, Fellner and Helmer, who did other opera houses around Europe. And it's pretty remarkable for its size and grandeur, and that sculptural dazzle of all those figures around the outside. It also has a horseshoe-shaped auditorium, which has incredibly sensitive acoustics and lets singers perform at whisper-low volume. The this wasn't Odessa's first opera house. Before it, there'd been a simpler building which was built in 1810, pretty soon after the city was founded, but wrecked in a fire in 1873. Now, they were both built on the same site, which is just along from the port and the Potemkin stairs, and close to the coast to receive touring Italian and French companies, for which Odessa was then their first stop in the Russian Empire. Now, this first theatre was owned by an Italian who somehow, either by accident or design, was also the manager of the Odessa port quarantine. Odessa had a quarantine because it was a busy year-round booming port right from the start. And quarantining newly arrived passengers at their own cost was the accepted way of stopping diseases coming ashore. One of the world's first lockdowns, I think, took place in Odessa after it was affected by a plague epidemic, the Ottoman plague epidemic of the early 1810s, in which 3,000 residents of Odessa died, but a lot more would have done if the governor had not locked the city down. So this Italian who ran the opera house and the quarantine was a shrewd businessman. I think he may have been. You might call him more than that. But he realised he could work this situation to his advantage. Whenever ticket sales for the opera house were in the doldrums, he would simply declare a new infectious disease at Constantinople and order all new visitors to be detained at the quarantine at their own expense. He would then use the income from the quarantine to engage the most popular box office divas from Europe to draw in the crowds and raise the fortunes of the opera house, which was, I guess you could say, an early example of imaginative public subsidy for the arts. And I wanted to tell this story because it seems to me to sum up many aspects of Odessa's character and history, its Italian and European influences, its love of the arts and music, its habits of cunning and not quite legal ways of making money, its ability to survive in ingenious ways in adversity. The story also left behind a saying in Odessa that people still use today. And forgive my Russian. Чем хуже чума, тем лучше опера. The worse the plague, the better the opera. So, a little bit about my involvement with the city. I discovered it more or less by accident in the mid-1990s at the end of a boat trip down the Dnipro to Crimea. I was no more than an opportunistic young writer looking for things to write about. But I had become interested in the big changes going on in Eastern Europe after the Soviet Union collapsed. And I'd read a wonderful piece by Bruce Chatwin about traveling down the Volga. And I thought, well, I can't go there. But I noticed that Ukraine was bisected by this extraordinarily long, and as it turned out, historically very important river called the Dnieper or Dnipro, and that there were riverboat cruises that went from Kiev down to Sevastopol and to Yalta. So that was that. I got a piece commissioned and off I went. Now, Ukraine had declared independence in 1991. So I climbed on board the riverboat, glided for 10 days downriver and into the Black Sea at Kherson. And one of the things I immediately loved about Ukraine was that it just kept throwing up so many stories. The first thing that happened was I met a retired British accountant from Croydon, except that he wasn't. He was originally Ukrainian. He, as a boy in the countryside near Kharkiv, he deserted from the Red Army, age 16, in 1943, and walked right across Ukraine as far as Vienna, where he survived by working for the Germans. He deserted because he'd been rounded up and given a rifle to share with another boy when the Red Army arrived in his village. But the Red Army made a wrong move and executed his uncle, who was a local policeman who they immediately assumed had been collaborating with the Germans. And he felt that this was bad enough for him to want to leave straight away, as well as obviously only having half a rifle to fight with. But he wasn't the only one. That was just the first. In the bar on the riverboat, I met a dying man and his two friends taking him on a last holiday. Young guy, wearing a very smart shell suit. Didn't look as if he was dying, but they were all getting absolutely hammered on Shustov vodka in the bar. And I stayed with them long enough to find out the story. He was an engineer, and he had worked at Chernobyl, and he'd actually hung over reactor number 4 in a helicopter for 3 days, directing the lead and sand that they were dumping into the core of reactor number 4. So those were the kind of stories I was just hearing almost, they were just coming at me thick and fast. And then right at the end of this rather extraordinary riverboat trip, we came to Odesa. And that is an early picture of Odesa. I'm not sure is that the one I wanted? Yes, it's okay. Well, let's have the early picture of Odesa, because I only found this yesterday, and I was really delighted I found them. This was a city that was founded in 1794 by Catherine the Great on the recommendation of the general who'd beaten the Ottomans in a battle that lasted half an hour and taken the territory for the Empress. But if you look towards the right of the slide, you will see the earliest version of the Potemkin stairs in that staircase that goes down to the shore. And that's where 200 years later I arrived at the sea station. I had not, I think, even noticed that it was on the itinerary, because after the sort of climax of arriving in Crimea, Odesa was just the last place we were stopping at before we got on our trains and planes and went home. So the riverboat slithered across the sea and towards the sea station and docked. And in the distance, I could see this monumental stone stairway. And I know why these slides are here. If you look at that sort of slightly rounded building down at the bottom, that was the quarantine, and there is actually another closer view of it there. So you get an idea of what the conditions. People said the quarantine was quite comfortable, and that it wasn't too bad having to spend a few days there. But I don't know whether they had the full idea of why they might be staying there on the false pretenses. So I saw the stone stairway. I saw was this one, which was on the title slide, and above it these threads of merchants' mansions spreading either side along Primorsky Boulevard, and from dry land as I stood on the dock, it just looked impossibly high. There's 192 stairs in the staircase, and not completely real. It looked a little like an invitation to walk up and step into a dream. And then when you get to the top, and you reach the statue of the Duc de Richelieu, which you can see in the distance, just right in the center at the top of the stairs, and the Chestnut Avenue of Primorsky Boulevard there, you realize just how created and engineered all these views and the layout is, for which the Duc de Richelieu must take probably the bulk of the credit. And the city sort of has this almost designed unfolding like a time lapse film of a rose opening as you walk further and further and further. So I walked all afternoon and early evening, and I was sort of diving into these gold-soaked Orthodox churches, just strolling for probably a few miles along these impossibly wide boulevards, giving my Ukrainian currency to old women, getting lost in the back streets. Went to the opera, where I nipped in and bought a ticket for the equivalent of 24p in the stalls for highlights from Carmen and some Glazunov. But in the space of just that first afternoon and evening, the city showed me enough to make it really mysterious, kind of improvised as well as designed, but kind of almost just appealing to the imagination at every turn, held together by the theatre of life that was going on in the streets. It really did feel like a country beyond the back of the wardrobe. It also felt as if anything should happen there. I think trying to be practical, I think the real secret does lie in those endless shaded boulevards lined with these waves of neoclassical buildings. And even after 74 years of communist rule, they still match a French visitor's description in the 1830s, who gave me the title for this talk, actually, who wrote that Odesa looked as if it was created by a magic wand. I suppose the one city I can compare it to is Naples, but Naples is a bit of a monument to spontaneity and chaos, and Odesa is actually more organized, constructed on a very sophisticated grid system, sophisticated and airy. I mean, a bit more like Haussmann's Paris, 50 years before it happened, I would say. But in those days, when I first got there, I just want to say a little bit about the atmosphere in the 1990s. It was wild and pretty criminal. The city was a bit of a mess. It was crumbling, rather like a dusty Sleeping Beauty, but being kissed awake by a guy in a blacked out Mercedes with a handgun in the glove box. There were very few cars and no advertisements, no billboards. There were big German sedans imported after almost certainly being stolen to order in the EU that hurtled down the cobbles of Pushkinska Street to the casino of the London Sky Hotel. Protection rackets were everywhere. Everybody knew that it was almost impossible to live life on the right side of the law. There was a man known as Karabas from a Russian fairy tale who controlled almost everything, entering and leaving the city. He was not actually a totally appalling person. He hardly ever carried a gun, hardly ever used violence. People regarded him very much as a godfather towards the good end of that spectrum in the city. But he got involved in a fight over who would control the energy sector, but particularly the oil sector, as it came into Odesa, and he got on the wrong side of the people who wanted to win at any cost, and he was murdered in 1997, machine gunned in the courtyard of one of Odesa's steam baths, and there was thereafter a gang war. The editor of the evening paper was murdered for campaigning against the corruption that was going on. It was a really quite turbulent time in the late 90s, and actually when the dust settled, there were still 4 mafia groups looking after it: Ukrainian, Russian, Armenian, and Chechen. So after my first visit to the city, I was determined to come back. And when I did in 1999, I met a painter who was working in the city, and a year later we got married. The sort of profile of my future wife's family actually seemed to sum up the new Ukraine somewhat. Her father, my wife's father, was a very distinguished wheat scientist, very much an incorruptible worker for the nation's good. Her mother worked at the port in the agricultural quarantine department, and her cousin was second in command of one of the two Crimean mafia groups, the Bashmaki. The Russian speakers among you will know that is the Boots gang. The head of the gang came to our engagement party and gave me a gold cigarette lighter and told me to learn better Russian. I think there may be. Here are some slides of the beauties of the architecture, just here and there. And I included this one with the interior because it's a very recent picture, and it's actually the first floor of the Museum of Modern European Art in Odesa. And as you can see, it's completely empty because they had taken everything off the walls and put it into storage because of the bombing. But it still left this extraordinarily ornate and beautiful room behind. And this, I thought I might just include this. I've only ever shown this once before because not that I think they'll come after me, but it is the only photograph that I know of 4 members of the Bashmaki at lunch with us in Odesa. Down at the end of the table is the chap who gave me the gold cigarette lighter and told me to learn better Russian. To his right, so on his left rather, is my wife's cousin, and the other 2 are chaps from Odesa whose names I've now lost in the mist of time. And just in case you're wondering which one was my wife, the second from the left. So there we are. Just a little domestic detail. So back to Odesa. The story starts where you want it to. I think that's the most important thing about the city. There are so many narratives. The Russian imperial narrative and that of the USSR and the Putin era is that Odesa is a Russian city, mythically and historically associated with Russian culture because it was established by Catherine the Great after that grabbing of the territory from the Ottomans. It was certainly the Russian Empire's gateway to the Mediterranean and Europe, and very much the heart of the imperial Riviera. It was a sort of the place where northern Russians came to recover and for recreation. Now, I'm told, could we have some more? Yes, some more of these. I just included these because I thought that they might be interesting just from an early perspective. There again, in the middle of the slide, you can see the first staircase. And it gives you, I think, a really good idea of the geography of the city and the way in which that cliff is not, it's not just a little insubstantial slope leading up to the main part of the city. It is actually a real cliff. And it gives the city a major part of its geographical character. There's a better view of the first staircase and Katerininska Circus at the top and the first mansions on Primorsky. And there is the top of the Potemkin stairs and that circus again, with a slightly better view of the statue of the Duc de Richelieu. And there is one of the mansions of today, which I spotted on a dull winter morning back in 2022. I was just trying to find a signal, and I crossed the road. All the the lines were down, the power was out, and I crossed the road hoping that I might sort of grab a little wisp of a signal from the other side of the street. And as I looked up from my phone, I saw exactly this picture of this mansion, which of course has been turned into shops and cut up into individual flats, and they've all been messed up and remade and had non-standard windows put in. But you can see that this is was originally the kind of house that a merchant would have had built for themselves. And I rather love it because we'll talk a little bit perhaps about the UNESCO admitting the Odesa's historic centre to as a heritage site in a little while. But I love that very much. Pere Goriot, at the end of Balzac's novel, says on his deathbed, "I'm going to go to Odesa. I'll make starch. I'll manufacture starch. I'll make millions." And I look at that mansion and I think, yes, actually, that might have been the kind of place that he would have liked to live in. But all these present and even 19th century claims ignore the fact. Well, they ignore the history that a 14th century Tatar settlement on the site of the modern city had been ceded to the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and then to the Ottoman Empire in the 16th century. That Odesa's Moldavanka district, its traditionally Jewish and criminal quarter, grew out of a settlement by Moldavians and Greeks that predated Russia's city by 30 years. That Odesa's first two governors, the Duc de Richelieu and Count Louis de Langeron, were French. That the soldier who captured the territory from the Ottomans was a Spaniard in Russian service, José de Ribas, and that Frans de Volant, the engineer who master planned the city for de Ribas, was Flemish. Further back still, and here we have a Levantine connection. The Greeks founded colonies along the western Black Sea coast as early as the 7th century BCE. Odesa was once the site of a large Greek trading settlement called Borisfet, before the Goths, Huns, and others destroyed the last Greek sites in the 4th century. Black Sea trade returned 900 years later when merchants from Venice, Pisa, and Amalfi founded colonies there until the fall of Constantinople interrupted commercial activity in the Black Sea. The Tatar settlement I mentioned, which was called Khaji Bey, dates from the early 1400s. So today's Odesa, the one that we've been talking about, is really very young, just over 230 years old. And the way it looks reflects that. In appearance, it was really built to seduce from every angle. And that may be because the first two governors were French, who knows. Captains sailing from the Mediterranean or the Sea of Azov would have been presented with those emerald wooden cliffs and the flush of mansions on Primorski Boulevard, whereas travellers from Romania, Bessarabia, and Podolia would, across the steppe, see mile by mile merchants' houses rise into view like a sort of Italianate El Dorado. Mark Twain landed at Odesa in the 1860s and wrote that he thought it looked like an American city. He felt at home there. He wrote, "Fine broad streets and straight as well, a stirring business look about the streets and the stores, fast walkers, a familiar new look about the houses and everything." Those streets were laid out for expansion, for mercantile expansion. And a mix of circumstances had enabled the city in the 19th century to grow at an absolutely fabulous rate. As you said, Michael, the urbanization and industrialization of Western Europe had created a huge market for Ukrainian wheat, and Odesa became the empire's chief exporter of cereals. So one thing that made this happen, apart from the wheat, was that Richelieu and the other governors realized that they needed labor, they needed manpower, and their migration policies were extraordinarily liberal. I mean, the word went out, of course, in Odesa. Odesa's reputation for making fortunes drew in Greeks, Armenians, Turks, Tatars, French, Germans, Italians, Poles, English, and provincial poorer Russians, poorer Ukrainians rather, Russians and Jews. All the trades and all the more illicit activities too. Seasonal workers, labourers, smugglers, brokers, gangsters. The Moldavanka district absorbed the less pecunious arrivals. The newspaper Odeski Vestnik reported in 1874 that many day labourers in Odesa spend the night on the street, sleeping in empty barrels, even in the rain. But the city was extraordinarily well connected to the rest of Europe from the beginning. In a story called In the Basement by the great writer Isaac Babel, if you haven't read them, his Odessa stories are indispensable, wonderful. The father of one of the characters is glimpsed at his dacha reading the latest edition of the Manchester Guardian to arrive. By the late 19th century, a third of the city's population was Jewish, and only about half the population spoke a Slavic language. Odessa was the most polyglot and cosmopolitan city in the Russian Empire, much more so than St. Petersburg. And even then, it lured Europeans with its stories of financial success, as I mentioned, old Goryeo in Balzac's novel. Visually, aesthetically, there is something also that writers and poets have noticed about the city. There is something extraordinarily, it's an extraordinary draw to explore that Black Sea coast around Odessa. Because it's, if you like, on the edge of Europe, there's this sense of suggestion, transition. The shore faces east, and the sea washes between the Western world and the Eastern, between, if you like, an understood place and an unknown one. Especially in winter. I noticed this when I went for long walks in 2022. When you've got these steely waves and a marble sky, and the city seems to just be rocking there on tiptoe, with all of Asia spread out in front of it. So the new city was constructed over miles of catacombs, quarried under the city to supply the sandstone for building, catacombs that would later become a refuge for Odessa's resistance against the Nazis. The sandstone is very soft. It's actually a stone which is called coquina because it's made up of not very compressed sandstone, which still has little bits of coquille or seashells in it. And the fact that the buildings have remained standing for 200 years is really thanks to the craftsmanship of the Italians and the Italian masons and Greek carpenters who built them. I just want to say a word about the Italians. They did take an early role in the city, helped by the fact that although José de Ribas, who was the first administrator and the chap who'd taken it from the Ottomans, although he was Spanish, he'd grown up in Naples. He was the son of the Spanish consul in Naples. By 1997, 3 years after the city was founded, there were already 800 Italians living in Odessa, 10% of the population, mostly traders. De Ribas actually wrote something which I rather like about the new city, describing it as predominantly Italian. The sky, the sun, the architecture of the buildings, the paintings in the churches, the street names, strade and stravelli, the first ships from Naples and Messina, the first shopkeepers, first grocery shops, first wine cellars, the pasta, the first tomatoes, and the first operas, with a reflection and echo of blessed Italy. So the style, as you can see, is mostly neoclassical, tinged with Baroque, and very rivalrous. There's so much distinction and individuation in the buildings, and merchants competed as they do to outdo each other in grandeur. And one interesting detail that I noticed over time was that most of the city's mansions are actually rather wider than they are deep, because front was what mattered more than substance, or more than depth, width more than depth. This one on the slide is a very good example of that, not deep at all. Just a couple more fun facts. For a long time in the 19th century, the street names were actually both in Russian and Italian. And a song called O Sole Mio, which you may know, a Neapolitan song, was actually composed in 1898, but not in Italy. It was written while its two authors were staying in Odessa. So I always think when you look at a building like that, you've got to understand that the beauty has partly to be imagined. I love ruins. I'm a ruin junkie, and so a building like that to me is as attractive, possibly even more attractive than its restored version. And in your imagination, you know, once you've sort of assimilated that idea to some extent, you can see how these streets will take their place alongside the great streets of Europe. Odessa developed very rapidly. There was huge energy from the immigrant population. There was huge wealth flowing in and out of the city. But then towards the end of the 19th century, the boom years never last, did they? And tensions grew between the rich and the less rich, between the Russians and the Greeks and the Jewish population. And the boom years turned to unrest. There was revolutionary agitation by the poorer citizens, alongside pogroms, most notably from 1905, which saw the worst pogrom in Odessa's history, with 400 Jews murdered, and the serious instability that characterized the 1905 revolution. That, incidentally, was when the battleship Potemkin mutinied, and that was, of course, when the sailors of the battleship Potemkin took the Potemkin to Odessa, and which is why that very famous scene appears in Eisenstein's film of the pram tumbling down the staircase. But it's important to remember that Odessa was always a political city. It wasn't actually hugely loved by Moscow and Petersburg, because it was too much itself. It was too much its own city for the two really central cities of the empire. So that's why it didn't get a railing until quite late on. And it's also perhaps why Pushkin was exiled there, because it was thought of as a place of exile rather than a center. But just want to mention one very important aspect of its political activity. It was that in 1814, which is only 20 years after it was founded, it was home to 3 Greeks who formed the secret Society of Friends. The Can you pronounce the Greek version?
It's the Filiki Eteria.
Beautifully said. The Filiki Eteria of Phanariot Greeks, mainly Phanariot Greeks, that ignited Greece's struggle for independence. And that house is still standing in Greek Square, Ploshta Kiritska. And another last view of the Italians. Quite a lot of the 19th century buildings will have an Italian welcome in the mosaic in the hall. But that is the house on Greek Square where the Society of Friends first hatched the plans for Greece's struggle for independence. Odesa was always a city of writers and musicians. It was Tarbal's home, Anna Akhmatova's home, Yuri Olesha, Ilfant Petrov, Valentin Katayev, and Alexander Kozachinsky, Kornei Chukovsky, David and Igor Oistrach, Sviatoslav Richter, Shura Cherkassky, and Maria Grünberg. But before the First World War, the poisoned atmosphere of pogroms and unrest provoked a huge exodus, mostly of Jews, to Europe and the New World. Much to our advantage, George Gershwin's parents came from Odessa, as did Serge Gainsbourg's father and grandfather. Bob Dylan's grandparents emigrated after the 1905 pogrom, and the French singer Joe Dassin's grandfather, Samuel, thinking he was being asked at Ellis Island, where he'd arrived from, said Odessa, and the US official misheard and wrote down the surname Dassin. So I was married in a monastery opposite the main railway station, and I think, yes, there we go. That's a very recent photo of the monastery of Saint Panteleimon. The only reason I'm telling you that is because after we got married, we lived in Odessa for the best part of a year, and we did a lot of exploring. And one of the interesting things about exploring was coming back to the city after you'd been away, either in the backcountry behind Odessa or in other parts of Ukraine. And each time we came back, and this is quite an important point really about the way Odessa behaves and the way it sees itself, we felt we were entering a very self-contained world, one that, in a good way, it didn't seek to be a center of wealth or power particularly, it just wanted to be itself. It loved its own performance, it loved its own romance and excitement. It didn't care much for legality or rules. It felt a little bit superior. Born Odessans call themselves Odessa's people. They had to identifying themselves as Ukrainian or Russians. And the aristocracy of Odessa is those who've lived there the longest. Because of the strong element of survival in the city, in life in the city, the jokes are really important. Humor is really important. Alongside energy and personality, wit is hugely valued. The Odessa-born satirist Mikhail Zhvanetsky said, "You're going to die anyway, you might as well die laughing." And if you found yourself caught in a siege and someone said, "Let's have a party," it will be odds on they have a grandmother from Odessa. On the 9th of May, 2022, Russia first attacked the city in earnest. 3 Kinjal missiles and 4 rockets struck it on that weekend. But my brother-in-law texted me with photos of people using the sandbag machine gun emplacements to sunbathe in. And also reported that he'd driven past the Moldavanka that evening. And there were tables and chairs outside and people were drinking, singing and dancing. So I called my book Undefeatable because I wanted to reflect the city's extraordinary instinct to survive and defend its particular character. That word undefeatability seems to sum up Odessans' sense of place and belonging, even in the toughest of circumstances. This is an interesting. There's an interesting comparison to be made, perhaps, with the Second World War, when Romanian and German troops laid siege to the city. It took them 73 days, and they had to launch 4 assaults before they finally captured it in October 1941. It cost them 340,000 troops. No, it took 340,000, but it cost them 100,000 casualties to subdue the city. In the 3 days after an explosion by the partisans, which blew up the new military commander's headquarters, the reprisals meant that 34,000 Odessan Jews were shot or burned to death. And whether they were Jewish or not, Odessans were arbitrarily shot throughout the occupation, everywhere, in their apartments, on site, in the streets and markets. In the first week of the occupation, 10% of the population was murdered. Yet the partisan bands went on resisting from the city's catacombs almost up to Odessa's liberation in April 1944. So it was one of the first 4 Soviet cities to be awarded the title of Hero City in 1945. Yeah, there's a new threat, obviously, now, since 24th of February 2022. Because this time the invasion force had to come from the east, and thanks to Russia's army's incompetence and Ukraine's resistance, it has not made it to Odessa yet. And when I first went in the winter of 2022, spent a month there, it was not much damaged. It is vulnerable from the sea and from launch sites in Crimea, where it's been most shelled from, but it has had protection, and this is terribly important as an example of how Odessa's identity is changing. It was protected by the residents of Mykolaiv and Voznesensk, one big town, one small town, about 150 kilometers away, in blocking the Russian troops at the start of the war and repelling their advance. Putin definitely wanted to take Odessa, landlock Ukraine, and join up with Transnistria in Moldova. But one result of that resistance by the citizens in Mykolaiv and Voznesensk is that the Odessans were and are incredibly grateful to them. And there are, I was told a complicated joke, which I can't repeat because I won't get it right, but about how the registration plates of the cars in Mykolaiv have 2 letters at the beginning, and it means something like bloody heroic. It's an abbreviation for bloody heroic, something like that. Anyway, this is just a sign of the way in which Odessans have sort of just one small sign of how they've begun to think, maybe survival isn't just down to us. Maybe it's down to the Ukrainians around us, also helping us. So since the war started, I've been back to the city half a dozen times. It's being bombed more and more regularly, under daily attack from drones and ballistic missiles, often using cluster munitions and double tap attacks. I mean, really vile stuff with the second strike time to hit the target, which is always a civilian target, by the way. just after the emergency responders have arrived, so killing the emergency responders. One that I know why that slide crept in. I forgot to annotate my text for that. But that is a beach in Odessa on an afternoon last August, when if there was a soundtrack of the 5 minutes before that photo was taken, before I took that photo, you'd have heard 2 bombs hitting the port in Odessa a few miles away. But the people on the beach just carried on. And this is perhaps a sign of just how insistent the Odessans are about continuing, and the Ukrainians actually, are continuing to resist by having as normal a life as possible and go to the beach and taking in sunshine. Michael, do you need to make a move?
Unfortunately, I must leave. But Philip is going to take over the Q&A.
Let's pause.
Don't worry about me. You keep going.
Okay.
You keep going.
Okay. Good. And well, this is just one. I just wanted to give you one quick illustration of the way in which the city is having to deal with the current state of aggression from Russia. This is from May last year, when a ballistic missile using cluster munitions hit the sea to the south of Odessa, hit the coast to the south of Odessa at Arcadia. These two places are about 300 meters apart, and on the left you have one of the international university buildings, which was hit and which caught fire, and there is the damage done. On the right is the aftermath of a tragedy, a cluster munition which only hit those 4 paving slabs, killed the woman sitting on the bench, taking in the evening sunshine. So that's the indiscriminateness of a ballistic missile with cluster munitions, which is just, I think, worth absorbing for a moment, because it is a terrible thing, and they are used and continue to be used even more intensively daily across the country, and not just in Odessa. I'm not sure whether this is going to work, because that is, let me just, do we have any volume? Do we have any sound? The only reason this little amateur video is here is because I just wanted to give you a little bit of the atmosphere of the centre of the city when an air raid is going on. So there is an air raid siren going on in the background, but
the audio goes through my computer, so it wouldn't work.
Right, not to worry. And there is the sandbag Duc de Richelieu. But as you see, life in the city continuing. 30 years ago, it never occurred to me that one day I would look back from the top of the Potemkin stairs and see Russia's shadow cast over the scene. The only bit of bombing that the Russians got right is that hotel at the end of the sea station, which was empty, by the way. It has been closed because of a corruption scandal for several years. It was a total blot on the landscape, and even Odessans were saying that they were glad that it had been bombed. So that's not just me bringing my outsiders aesthetics onto it. Odessans hated it. Blue and silver glass, absolutely horrible. Anyway, it will be taken down now, and I hope replaced with something somewhat more elegant. People are trying to get on with their lives in the city. As soon as the all clear sounded on that day, last year, all the streets, the squares, the Primorsky Vula, all filled up with walkers. There was suddenly out of nowhere there was a wedding party posing for photographs. Groups of young people doing street dance rehearsals. And there was an amateur fashion shoot. Students suddenly appeared with their easels and restarted their art class. So ordinary life does go on as a form of resistance as much as anything else. Yeah, I'm just thinking that the UNESCO's recognition. I want to talk about UNESCO's recognition of Odessa's historical centre as a World Heritage Site. I love what they say in their text about it, citing eclectic diversity in architectural styles and multicultural and multi-ethnic traditions of Eastern European cities of the 19th century. But just across the hotel, just across from the hotel where I was staying, was this place, a strip bar. I never went in. But I was. It was curious to me that even on the blackout nights they had a generator and they kept working. Just after I took this photo, and I didn't want to photograph them, but three of the dancers came out. They were laughing in a huddle, finishing their cigarettes, and I just thought that's as much a part of Odessa as and perhaps it's a good example, perhaps not, but the mess of life that's there, the kind of catering for everything aspect of life in the city is as much a part of its identity and its attraction, at least for me. Even though, as I say, I never darkened the door of that particular establishment. I think what UNESCO talks about when it talks about multicultural, multi-ethnic traditions, diversity in architectural styles, I think that kind of embraces what Odessans call the city's colorit, its color, its exoticness, its flashiness, but the identity of the city is really a more movable dial than any UNESCO citation can really, I think, encompass. It's about beauty, absurdity, dilapidation, solidarity, fantasy, criminality, poverty, ingenuity, fortune, romance, sex, jokes, and I dare say many other things. What I love about the city is its irrepressibility and its humanity, and that does encompass practically everything. There is one joke about Odessa I particularly like. I think, in fact, Zelensky told the joke when he went on a visit there. Two Jewish men of a certain age returned to Odessa after a long spell away, and getting out of their taxi from the airport in the city centre at the top of the main street, Deribasivska Street, they put their suitcases down. One says, "Look at the city. It's changed so much. I don't recognize my city." The other one looks down and says, "Moshe, our suitcases have been stolen." And the first one throws up his hands and says, "Ah, now I recognize my city." So that is Odessa. It seems to create itself afresh every morning and every night. It is strategically enormously important as Ukraine's biggest port. That is why Putin particularly covets it. But the irony is that just as Russia's war has crystallized Ukraine's sense of its own identity, Odesa, despite having been Russian speaking and Russian leaning, something of a state within a state in the nation of Ukraine, now aligns itself more and more wholeheartedly with Ukraine's resistance against Putin's greed. Perhaps the main reason for that realignment is that Odesa has always asserted its freedom. That colorit that I mentioned is like a painting that in the space of 10 generations since the modern city was founded has been repainted many times, but whose atmosphere and characters have stayed the same. There's no end of storytelling in the city, and the story's quantity and flavour effortlessly manufactured colour. And that happens because Odesa and Odessans have fewer boundaries. They feel free. And today, that freedom of theirs means that by choice, the city and its people belong much more to Ukraine. And Ukraine belongs more to Odesa as it has become resolutely alive to its own freedom than either did when I first climbed the Potemkin stairs 30 years ago. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Julian, for that wonderful description with love of Odesa. And I'm sure there'll be many questions. And please help yourselves to water, anybody. And I would like to start with the question. You talked about it being polyglot, and this in fact was one of the definitions of a Levantine city. Alexandria and Istanbul were also polyglot. Can you tell us what languages did you hear most in Odesa?
That's a very good question. I think historically you could certainly say that all those communities in the 19th century spoke their own languages, Philip, and Italian was very commonly spoken on the streets and in the shops,
As it was in Alexandria.
Yes.
And Istanbul.
I think now you would say that what's changing is that when I first went to Odessa, it was Russian.
Yeah.
And now conversations are much more frequently in Ukrainian, and even among people who are not, if you like, or don't feel the need to make a big effort to learn Ukrainian, there's a sort of new convention of politeness has developed in which conversations start and finish in Ukrainian. And also you will find that people speak much more English as well, because there's been a good deal of obviously a good deal of news and journalism. People are sort of polishing up their English. They want to communicate with foreigners, but still a lot of Russian spoken. But definitely, it's considered bad manners to start a conversation in Russian in the city. Not perhaps university. I'm not just going to punch you, but you know, people prefer to start and finish their conversations in Ukrainian.
Thank you. More questions?
Can I ask about Richelieu? Why were the first two governors French?
Very interesting. It was because of the French Revolution, and they had both gone. They were both more or less fugitives from the French Revolution who'd set themselves up in Catherine the Great's service, and I think by all accounts, the Duke of Richelieu was quite a proud man, and he'd had a few run-ins with Catherine, but ultimately they got on pretty well, and he was appointed after Deribas, he was appointed governor, and then Longeron, who also had been in the service of the Empress, it came along in the same way. But they were both fugitives, and I think, in fact, that Richelieu went back to France.
Yes, he became prime minister.
Yes.
1815 to 1819.
Yes.
And it was said of him, the word of the Duc de Richelieu is worth a treaty. He was appointed partly because Russian troops were then occupying France. So he was an intermediary with Alexander. More questions?
Yes. Is there a connection between Theodore Herzl and Odessa? Have you come across that?
No.
I have a vague recollection that he hailed from Odessa, in which case, if it's true, Odessa would be responsible for the existence of Israel, whether you like it or not.
Yeah, you're going to send me back to my books tonight. I will find
I
out.
have a memory of reading a book.
I think you may
being a young
be
man
right. I think you
in
may be
Odessa.
right. Yeah.
Okay.
What was the proportion of Jews among the population in 1914, roughly?
Jews among the population in 1914.
Yeah.
Oh, much lower. It would have been down to single figures, I think. But many left before the.
There were two big pogroms in 1871 and I think 1859,
Yes.
when the majority of Jews, well, if they could, they ran away, and if they couldn't, they are still somewhere there.
Yes. I mean, having said that, as I say, a lot were murdered by the Axis 100 years later in the Second World War. But the numbers, as you say, they started to decline in the last 30 years of the 19th century. And then it got very nasty from 1905 up to the First World War. Yeah.
Was they Ashkenazi or Sephardic?
I
think
Ashkenazi, yes.
Well, I just wondered if there's a lot of Jews found their way into the Ottoman Empire, and I just wondered if they drifted out.
Yes.
Were the direct, before 1914, was the direct trade with America, direct emigration ships going to America?
Before 1914?
Yeah.
I would. I'm just trying to sort of cobble together bits of information that I know to be able to answer that, and I can't give you a categorical answer. But whether there were direct shipping or not, there would have been possibilities of, you know, getting a boat to Constantinople and then a boat on from there, or a boat to Italy. I remember when we came back from our year in the city, we took a ferry from Odessa to Constantinople, drove across to Patras, and then took another ferry up to Venice, and then drove from Venice home. So those kinds of.
Are there frequent ferries to Constantinople?
Yes. Yes.
A lot of trade.
Yes, absolutely. There is a huge market outside Odessa called 7 Kilometer Market, and most of the clothes and furniture that are sold there come from Turkey. Yes.
I have a sensitive question for you. What's your position towards the quantity of the letters S in the word Odessa being spelled in English? I understand that there is a Russian way to spell it with double S, and there is a Ukrainian way to spell it with one S. So what's your take on how it should be spelled now in foreign languages, aside from the Slavic ones?
For me, this isn't a sensitive question or a moral question. It's almost a question just of grammar, really, or just lexicography in the sense that in my book I said I'm spelling Odessa with one S because I'm in Ukraine and that's how Ukrainians spell it. But where it refers to the city as it existed in the Russian Empire or during the USSR, and there are publications from that time, I will put the second S back. So for the best example would be Isaac Babel's Odesa stories. I would spell it with two S's there because it was always thus. And I'm not an ethno-linguistic extremist, but I shy away from that because I don't think it's the most important issue.
Absolutely not. Just to keep your question for curiosity.
Yes, thank you. Yes,
Susan?
Everything you have to say about Odessa and the antique Greeks and the Italians and, well, indeed the Jews, but and Armenians, is even truer when in Crimea, when you get to Theodosia, which was, of course, the Genoese and the Venetians had an enormous stronghold there for the trade at the end of the Silk Road, which then was controlled by and even at the 1914, I mean, around then, you heard more Italian, Greek, and Armenian, and Georgian, all those languages in Theodosia. Well, and Tatar, Turkish.
Yeah.
Russian was this sort of elite playboy language, but
right.
But by the way, this is just going to make a sort of shameless plug that if anybody is moved by Odessa's plight and feels like doing something about it, I am strongly connected with a little outfit of one Ukrainian, two Brits, who do up pickup trucks and we take them over there in convoys, and a lot of theirs go to that coastline. And the last time I went was there. When I went in was that very night. The graffiti artists had resprayed it. The next morning, two guys from Odessa came and collected it. And those were the Marines, and they are vitally important for getting the wounded back to the field hospitals.
Yes.
Right the way along that front. So anyway, Philip knows how to find me, and any money that people want to give to something like that will find their way right there.
Well, Susan, when you and I are a sort of a platoon too, because when I'm not doing this, I'm doing exactly what you're doing. So I will get in touch with you. And we should talk about that. Yes, it is, as you say, totally vital.
With Jonathan Lewis.
Jonathan Mills.
Lewis.
Thank you. I'm Jonathan Lewis. If I might just add something, I can describe myself as a grandson of Odessa. My grandparents, who were Jewish, married in 1913 and came here immediately. In terms of Odessa's Jewish and Zionist history, at the turn of the 20th century, the Jewish community in Odessa was the second largest in Eastern Europe after Warsaw. Theodor Herzl was not a son of Odessa, but very many of that first generation of political Zionists were. The majority of the Jewish community were Ashkenazim from, of course, the vastness of Eastern Europe, but there were some Sephardim, for example, from Spain and Turkey, who had come to Odessa. And the sequel, one might say, to the story is that through a long and for me dramatic chain of events, I found and was reunited with my Odessan family and visited Odessa first in 2002, and then the following year, and then once again. The family is now only one single lady, and my family and I brought her here 3 years ago at the start of the war, and she's still here. So that's just a small personal contribution to the discussion, for which thank you so much for the talk.
Thank you. How interesting.
Yes, thank you very much. Indeed. Any more questions from the room? Well, I think we should give Julian another round of applause. His book is on sale now. He himself is managing the sales, and I think we might have a glass of wine.
Yes.
Now.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.